When people hear the words concentration camp, they invariably think of World War II and names like Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen and Treblinka come into mind. Images of trains packed with Jews unloading their human cargo, going to gas chambers and crematoria. They fail to realize a few historical facts. There was, in fact, a difference between a concentration camp and a death camp. One was for slave labor, and the other was a dedicated extermination center. The Soviet version was the Gulag, infamous for being the depository for millions of political dissidents that has been replicated throughout the communist world and still exists in China and North Korea today. But Germany did not create the concentration camp as we know it. Who created the concentration camp? Why was it created? How were they presented to the world, or were they covered up? What was the lasting legacy politically and historically? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Merriam-Webster Dictionary states, a concentration camp is a place where large numbers of people, such as prisoners of war, political prisoners, refugees, or the members of an ethnic or religious minority are detained or confined under armed guard, used especially in reference to camps created by the Nazis in World War II for the internment and persecution of Jews and other prisoners. This description is historically misleading because, as stated, the Germans in particular, the Nazis did not create the concentration camp. That distinction harks back to the Cuban War of Independence, but the concept was improved upon. After decades of resistance to Spanish rule by Cuban guerrillas fighting for independence, the local Spanish government was losing. In a final desperate attempt to punish the population, and to try to use psychological warfare against the people, Governor General Arsenio Martinez Campos had a plan. Campos wrote to the Spanish Prime Minister in 1895 to say that he believed the only path to victory lay in inflicting new cruelties on civilians and fighters alike. His plan was to isolate the fighters from the peasants who often fed, sheltered, and provided them intelligence. Campos decided that it would be necessary to relocate hundreds of thousands of rural inhabitants into Spanish-held cities behind barbed wire, a strategy he called reconcentración. This was a cruel plan given the fact that the freedom fighters had shown mercy to the Spanish wounded and had returned prisoners of war unharmed. Martinez Campos, faced with this fact, could not bring himself to launch the process of reconcentración against an enemy whom he saw as being honorable. He wrote to Spain and offered to surrender his post rather than impose the measures he had laid out as necessary. I cannot, he wrote, as the representative of a civilized nation, be the first to give the example of cruelty and intransigence. As a result of Campos's display of humanity, Spain recalled Martinez Campos and replaced him with General Valeriano Weyler, who would later become known as the Butcher. The world media was also watching this war, including a young soldier turned journalist named Winston Churchill. If he cannot make successful war upon the insurgents, wrote the New York Times in 1896, he can make war upon the unarmed population of Cuba, referring to Weyler. American and European observers would soon see inhumanity on a scale many thought impossible in that day and age. Weyler threatened to kill any peasant who did not relocate, and he kept his word. He had special barbed wire encampments built, guarded by soldiers, and within a year, the island held tens of thousands of dead or dying reconcentrados who were lionized as martyrs in the U.S. newspapers. No mass executions were necessary. Horrific living conditions and lack of food eventually took the lives of some 150,000 people. The subjugation and incarceration of people for a political purpose was nothing new, as displayed by the Native Americans placed on reservations or the British doing similar in Australia with the Aborigines. Technology also played a role in making these camps even more effective, such as the invention of automatic weapons, machine guns, barbed wire, and even electrified fencing. This allowed a small number of people to contain multitudes within a very small space or concentrated within a small geographical area. Americans were shocked at what was taking place, which instilled an anger against Spain that became a powder keg ready to be touched off by the time the USS Maine sank in Havana Harbor in February 1898. Public sentiment through journalism was prepared to go to war. Americans shipped millions of pounds of cornmeal, potatoes, peas, rice, beans, quinine, condensed milk, and other staples to the starving peasants, with railways offering to carry the goods to coastal ports free of charge. Such was the American response. Even President William McKinley said of the policy of reconcentration, quote, "It was not civilized warfare, it was extermination. The only peace it could beget was that of the wilderness and the grave." Ironically, the global outrage did not last very long, because as soon as Spain lost the Spanish-American War and the U.S. acquired the former Spanish colonial possessions of Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, etc., they then had their own problems. The camps that had been so derived suddenly became an expedient method of handling the insurgents, especially during the Philippine insurrection. By 1901, placing captured guerrillas in the same styles of camps previously condemned seemed like the best idea. While the conditions were somewhat better than what the Spanish provided, it was still less than humane. Upon seeing one camp, an army officer wrote, "It seems way out of the world, without a sight of the sea, in fact, more like some suburb of hell." Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, South Africa was in flames. The Boer populations of the Transvaal and Orange Free State were in open rebellion against British rule. Boers, also called Afrikaners, were settlers in southern Africa of both German and primarily Dutch descent since the 1600s. Previously, during the First Anglo-Boer War of December 16, 1880 to March 23, 1881, these settlers, the Boers, clashed with the British in the Transvaal region, rebelling against the oppressive rule from the British Cape Colony, and the Boers won their independence. But once the British discovered large amounts of gold and diamonds in Natal, Cape Colony, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, the British wanted to control all of South Africa. The Boers, on the other hand, were determined to maintain their independence, and they did have a treaty. The Second Anglo-Boer War was a continuation of these elements and started in 1899. After a year of trying to subdue the highly mobile and very effective Boer commandos, who used hit-and-run cavalry tactics supported by infantry, had proven costly to the British. Then, in February 1900, Lord Kitchener took control of the operation. The British had resorted to burning out the homes and farms of the families of the men and boys fighting in the field. The plan was to use psychological warfare, which also included destroying crops and killing or stealing livestock to starve the Boers out. It was advertised that if the men surrendered, their homes and families would be spared. The tactic did not work at first. So in March, Kitchener, seeing that his scorched earth policy was ineffective, decided on a new method to force compliance. Kitchener ordered over 200,000 women and children, as well as the elderly, taken from every Boer province and placed them in British-operated concentration camps. The conditions were horrific, placed behind barbed wire into bell tents or improvised huts, but many simply slept on the ground in the open, exposed to the elements. Lack of food, contaminated water, starvation, and no sanitation facilities killed tens of thousands, and almost every disease known eventually afflicted the prisoners. For a personal perspective, see our video on Peter Arnoldus Kruller, the subject of my book, Vorwar Boer, The Century and Life of Peter Arnoldus Kruller. The death toll in the camps mounted, and Kitchener tried to keep it from becoming public knowledge, but the word did get out, perhaps from soldiers riding home or those returning wounded who told their stories. More people died in the camps than died in combat. Polluted water supplies, the lack of food, and infectious diseases ended up killing tens of thousands of detainees, non-combatants. Even though the Boers were often portrayed as crude people undeserving of sympathy, the treatment of European descendants in this fashion was shocking to the British public. Less notice was taken of British camps for black Africans who had even more squalid living conditions and, at times, only half the rations, if any, allotted to white detainees. The news reached London and Parliament, especially after the inspection visit by Emily Hobhouse from London, who reported on what she saw, and had the idea of punishing civilians evoked horror among those who saw themselves as representatives of a civilized nation. When is a war not a war? Asked British Member of Parliament Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman in June 1901. When is it carried on by methods of barbarism in South Africa? Kitchener had placed a stain on the image of the British Empire by the time the Boer War ended in 1902, but camps soon appeared elsewhere. The world learned of the concentration camps, and in 1904 the Germans in their colony of Southwest Africa, now modern-day Namibia, created their own. German General Lothar von Trotha issued an extermination order for the rebellious Herero people, writing, "Every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot." That order was later rescinded soon, but the genocide did not stop. The surviving Herero, and later the Nama people as well, were herded into concentration camps and used as forced slave labor. They endured inadequate rations and lethal diseases. Before the camps were fully disbanded in 1907, German policies managed to kill some 70,000 Namibians in all, nearly exterminating the Herero. Effectively, in a 10-year period, the concentration camp had gone from an embarrassing political and social stigma to an acceptable method of controlling unruly populations for a military or political purpose. They also provided a way to control a population for the use of slave labor, and a place to put not just war captives, but also political dissidents and common criminals. It took just a decade for concentration camps to be established in wars on 3 continents. They were used to exterminate undesirable populations through labor, to clear contested areas, to punish suspected rebel sympathizers, and as a cudgel against guerrilla fighters whose wives and children were interned. Most of all, concentration camps made civilians into proxies in order to get at combatants who had dared defy the ruling power. Unlike prisons, which kept inmates for a specific period of time through a judicial punishment process, in reasonably decent conditions, the camps were simply collection points. The dead could be replaced. Of interest, during World War I, the camps saw a revival, especially with the camp method in Great Britain. It was believed that when war broke out, Germans living in Britain, if deported, would become soldiers at the front. The same occurred in the Axis nations as well. All these nations collected foreign nationals living within their borders. In response to this British policy, British Home Secretary Reginald McKenna batted away calls for universal internment, protesting that the public had no more to fear from the great majority of enemy aliens than they did from the ordinary bad Englishman. However, after the Lusitania was sunk in 1915, with the loss of more than 1,000 civilians, Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith ordered tens of thousands of German and Austro-Hungarian enemy aliens in England to be incarcerated. That included within the British Empire proper. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians did the same thing, gathering citizens from every Allied country, and as a result, concentration camps soon flourished around the globe. In France, Russia, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, Brazil, Japan, China, India, Haiti, Cuba, Singapore, Siam, modern-day Thailand, New Zealand, and many other places. Over time, concentration camps would become a tool in the arsenal of nearly every country. The United States had more than 2,000 prisoners in camps during the war. German-born conductor Karl Muck, a Swiss national, wound up in detention in Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia after false rumors were spread that he had refused to conduct the Star-Spangled Banner. However, there was a major difference in these camps as opposed to the previous camps we have mentioned. The camps in World War I were in areas very far from the fighting, and although there were certain hardships, there was not the death by attrition experienced in earlier conflicts, and the International Red Cross made inspections. The detainees could send and receive letters and packages. In some cases, money was transferred and accounts were kept. By the end of the war, more than 800,000 civilians had been held in concentration camps, with hundreds of thousands more forced into exile in remote regions. This was a more civilized approach toward placing people in camps during the First World War, removed most of the stigma and horror of concentration camps in general. People accepted the notion that a targeted group might turn itself in and be detained during a crisis, with a reasonable expectation to one day be released without permanent harm. Later in the century, this expectation would have tragic consequences. The Ottoman government, during and after World War I, until it was disbanded, had maintained a more isolated and expansive system of concentration camps with inadequate food and shelter to deport Armenians into the Syrian desert as part of an orchestrated genocide. See our video on the Armenian genocide. But there was one lingering after effect of the concentration camps, the fact that they were effective. And following the death of Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin created his own version called the Gulag. See our video on Stalin's Cannibal Island, the first Gulag. The concept of the concentration camp took on many forms. In the United States, the notorious chain gangs were a loose collection of camps, primarily throughout the southern states. These were, in fact, concentration camps where the treatment of inmates was often brutal, especially against blacks. But the 1930s in Germany, as well as in Japanese-controlled areas of China, saw the emergence of a new kind of concentration camp. Both the nations used labor camps as well as dedicated extermination camps, many for medical experiments. See our video on Unit 731 for Japan's activities. In 1993, Dachau near Munich was built as a concentration camp for political prisoners, and many would be released after re-education. But after 1941, when the mass murders of Jews and other undesirables by the Einsatzgruppen was proven to be inefficient, a new method was created. The first combination labor and extermination camp was built in Poland and named Auschwitz-Birkenau. Others followed throughout the German-occupied Europe, with camps being established simply for the purpose of killing, nothing else. The Soviets and Germans made their camps very public as a warning to the populations as to what they could expect if they ran afoul of their respective governments. But the Germans, being quite open about their re-education or concentration camps, were, despite post-war propaganda, very secretive about their death camps, and for good reason. During the January 20th, 1942 Wannsee Conference, 15 members of the SS and SA gathered to discuss the final solution. A total of exactly 24 people throughout Germany, in fact in the entire world, knew that that meeting even took place. Even Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer SS, agreed that, according to SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff during my personal interviews with him, stated, "Not even the most fervent member of the NSDAP, or National Socialist German Workers' Party, who had no problem with deporting Jews, may have had a hard time digesting the program of calculated extermination. That was why Himmler kept it top secret." End quote. Over 11 million people died as a result. In the USA, 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned in concentration camps called internment camps by the Franklin Roosevelt administration, as well as many ethnic Germans, Italians, and Hungarians, etc. Treatment in these camps was actually quite commendable compared to other nations. In Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam in the 1970s through the 1980s, and in China and North Korea today, these camps were used for many purposes, mostly as a source of slave labor and re-education. See our video on the Uyghur genocide in China. Untold millions have died as a result of imperialism, fascism, and communism. The concentration camps and gulags became symbols of man's inhumanity towards people, and they are an enduring image. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.